In this video, I'm going to walk you through the installation steps for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit on the 2013 through 2018 Kawasaki ZX-6R. I'll quickly review some of the key details of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator for the ZX-6R. It's going to be CNC laser cut, CNC formed from a single piece of 5052 aluminum coated in UV resistant satin black powder coat. So it should be extremely durable and match kind of the kind of factory finish on the undertail plastics really well. Some of the unique things that Vagabond does is that we use pressed-in studs as opposed to loose hardware, so it makes the install easy and gives you a really nice kind of flush underside appearance. We also fold in flanges from the license or turn signal side flanges and use that as part of our structure, so the stud is going through two thicknesses of metal, so it's extremely rigid even though it's extremely lightweight. Some of the things that we're also going to do is include rubber bumpers on the license plate flange to minimize kind of buzzing or rattling of the license plate. We're going to be set up to reuse all the DOT certified OEM hardware or OEM lights, so turn signals and license plate light. This Fender Eliminator is set up to be kind of like OEM grade, totally plug and play, and we're just going to take the lights out of the factory Fender and reinstall them into this Fender Eliminator. This kit is proudly made in the United States. We're going to include a full hardware kit that's going to be 4 M6 locking nuts, 2 M5 locking nuts, and then we're going to include 2 spare Phillips head pen head screws to serve as backups if when you're removing the factory turn signals you strip out the Phillips head screws that are on there, which is not too difficult to do. So we're just including 2 spares in case you manage to do that. As for tools you'll need for this install, you need a 5mm Allen key, either a long T-handle like this or a socket on an extension. You're going to need a 8 and a 10mm socket, hex socket. Now these deep sockets would probably be easier here. You need a Phillips head screwdriver. Very useful to have a small flathead screwdriver for some of the electrical connectors. And if you do have tools, power driver obviously make this a little faster, but especially if you have a right angle screwdriver, whether it's ratcheting or not, that makes the removal of the turn signals much easier. Now the first step in any Fender Eliminator install is going to be to remove the passenger seat, and the ZX-6R is going to be a key on the left side, shifter side of the undertail, and pulling up on the front of the passenger seat. Slide it forward and set it aside. Once you've got the passenger seat off, go ahead and first just take your tool, your factory tool kit out, just by lifting that elastic strap, pulling the canvas bag out. You can leave the strap in there. It's going to expose the fasteners you need to get to. Next we're going to disconnect the wiring. There's going to be like a rubberized metal wiring keeper. Kind of open that up and you'll see there's 3 looms coming out of the fender, and then the 3 wire loom going to your tail light. They're all going to get essentially packaged into a big rubber boot that you kind of have to pull out underneath the subframe. It's not going to be the easiest thing in the world, but kind of massage it out until you can expose the connectors inside. Now I mentioned that 3-pin connector for the tail light, and even though we're not going to essentially do anything with the tail light, there we go, get as much slack out as you can, and then if you can flip that boot back on itself so you can expose everything you need to. Now once you've got this rubber boot kind of rolled back, you'll see the big 4 connectors that you're going to need to disconnect. Now the big 3 wire for the tail light is not actually required, but it's the easiest one to make some space. So if you need a little bit more space in this boot, which often you do, you can disconnect that and kind of just tuck it out of the side. It'll give you more working space, make this easier. Then you're left with these smaller boxier connectors, 2 black connectors, 1 gray connector. There is a push tab on the back end of them. It's a little hard to get to. I much prefer a small screwdriver just to lift that tab up on the front side, and they disconnect very easily. So that's going to be 1 turn signal. Gray is going to be also turn signal, and then you'll be left with one more connector that actually has a physical tab on the far end. That's going to be your license plate light, and that one you actually do have to push down with the fingernail to get it to disconnect. Once you've got these three connectors loose, disconnected, we can move down to what's actually the 4 bolts holding the fender on. Now it may be a little hard to see from this camera view, but there's a pattern of 4 5mm Allen head bolts at the base of this, and this is going to be what's holding the factory fender on. And so there is a wiring. You can go ahead and loosen these all the way. Try not to drop any way down there. You can always retrieve them later with a magnet. But there's a wiring clip on the rearmost bolt on the shifter side, on the left side. And when you get that clip, we're gonna try to reuse it on the way back in. So just keep in mind where it is. And then when you're removing the fourth and last bolt, just hold on to the fender with your free hand so that it doesn't lock up the bolt, essentially bind it up, and then guide the, take that clip out. So we'll reuse this on the way back in, the new fender. And you really just have to take a little bit of time to push out one connector from the fender at a time, because they're kind of running out of this triangular hole that's only really big enough for that big chunky license plate light connector. So got them out one by one, and we'll break this break this fender down on the bench. Once you got the fender to the bench, we're just going to start with taking the license plate off. And every dealer is going to be slightly different on whatever hardware they provide. In case of Fun Bike, it's going to be Phillips and hex nuts on the back. Use a 12mm there. But that'll probably vary from dealer to dealer. Now once you've got license plate off, you'll see there are 2 5mm Allen sockets on the top side of the shell. So we're just going to split this shell in half, or this plastic fender in half. So there's going to be 2 on the top, and we're not going to reuse any of this hardware. So you can leave it all loose, or you can, what I would prefer or normally do, is put it all back together for storage. Then there's 2 additional, again, 5mm head bolts, socket head bolts, underneath the fender. All these bolts have red Loctite on them, so they may or may not give you a little bit of a fight, but use a good socket, Allen tool. The reflector bracket's going to come off as part of this. We're not going to reuse that either. Now when we look at what's actually inside the wiring side, there's only one retaining clip, and it's just like a little bridge, so all you do is slide your wiring looms out from underneath it, and start with a small turn signal just because they're easier, but thread all the wiring looms out through this primary plastic support piece, and then we'll get to removing the lights. So we'll start with the license plate light, but we're going to pull the lights out of this factory fender shell. For the license plate light, it's going to be 2 8mm hex head bolts, hex head nuts, kind of buried into this little pocket back here. Once you get those off, you can pull the license plate light and the loose hardware out. We are not going to use the grommet in this scenario, so you don't have to go any further than that. Now onto the turn signals, which historically can be kind of a trouble area on Kawasaki's. This one's not too bad because there's a little retaining plate on these rubber mounted turn signals on both sides, and they have a Phillips head screw, and the design is kind of such that you have to come at it at kind of an angle, and this angle with a standard Phillips is not too bad, so you can almost always get it. with a regular Phillips. But if Kawasaki makes them super tight, which historically they can do sometimes, you may start to feel like it's stripping out, and it can get kind of messy. If you do have one of these cool little right angle screwdrivers, they're extremely effective in here, and they'll make it much, I guess, less possible. Once you get it loose, you can always go back to a standard screwdriver to strip those out. In this kit, we are going to supply 2 extra versions, or 2 extra screws that will function in this hole. They'll be a little bit longer and they'll have a slightly larger pan head, but they'll be the same thread pitch. And so if you have to really mangle these screws on the way out to get your turn signals off the factory bike, we're going to give you 2 new screws just in case, to put them back into the Fender Eliminator. Now once you've got those plates off, the remaining steps are to kind of lift that plate up. You sometimes have to pry at it a little bit with a screwdriver. And we'll do one side first. So once the plate's up, there's going to be an interior threaded plate. So it'll have it's like a nut plate. And same thing, grab your Phillips screwdriver and pry it out. Pull that little nut plate out. We are going to reuse all this hardware. And then the last step for the turn signals is to kind of from the clear window side or the lens side, kind of grasp the turn signal and just pull it backwards, and it should pop right out. Famous last words. There we go. So we'll go back and quickly pop the plates on this one. Cover plate, the interior nut plate, and last step, grasp the turn signal as close to the base as possible so you're not really leveraging this junction, and rotate it out. Obviously the colder it is, the harder those are going to be to put in and out, but it's just a rubber grommet and you just want to pull that way specifically back because there's a little bit of a chamfer, a notch taken out of the front, so it should pop out easier that way. One of the questions we often get on our Fender Eliminator kits is how much weight they save, and in the case of the ZX-6R, if we load up our scale full of just the factory components that we are removing and we're not going to reuse, like lights and things like that, we'll get a true net weight loss. And I'm going to include all the hardware here that these are all the bolts that hold the fender shell together, license plate nuts, and then the 4 that hold this whole fender to the motorcycle, because we aren't reusing any of these. And we're right at, call it 1.67 pounds. So we quickly remove those and we put on the Fender Eliminator from Vagabond Motorsports and the hardware associated with that kit, which is going to be 6 K-locks, or locking nuts, will be right at 0.46. So by putting on, this is metallic, this is an aluminum kit and replacing a lot of plastic off the bike, but you're still cutting 1.2 pounds off the tail section of the motorcycle by installing the Vagabond Motorsports kit with all the factory lighting. Now once you've gotten your turn signals and license plate light removed from the factory fender, we can go about reinstalling them into the Fender Eliminator. So your turn signals should go in first. On the ZX-6R, they kind of have this upward kind of kink to them. You can always tell which one it is, right versus left, based on the print on the lens. But for reference, the left turn signal is going to be black and the right will be gray. The way these install is essentially the reverse of how they were removed, which is you start by just feeding your wiring loom through, and then you're going to seat this inner part of the groove of the, I guess, the forward portion of the turn signal in this little kind of squared off section of the license or turn signal flange on the Fender Eliminator. And once you get that seated, you just rock the whole assembly in, and it should fully seat in that groove. And it should be very secure. Once you get one side in, it's a little easier to go direct in with the screwdriver to help set this in, so we'll go one side at a time. Once you get it popped into the grommet, all you have to do is thread through that retaining ring, or the retaining nut plate. And the way that that installs, there actually are some little like teeth on the inside of that grommet base. And what I find is the easiest way is to get it seated under at least the front half or the rear half, whatever you is seems to be easier to get in. For example, like you can kind of shove the back half of it in and then push it back. Should get a good angle for here. What I mean by that is you can kind of slide it under two of the, in this case, the forward teeth, hold that section down, and push in the rest of it. And you should be able to kind of feel a nice little pop or a click, and it gets fully seated under the grommeted base. At that point, what you have to do is you have to put that essentially retaining plate on top of your nut plate, and if you have managed to not strip out the Phillips head screws, congratulations, reinstall them, and on one side anyways you'll get a straight shot through the turn signal hole. On the other side, go ahead and tighten up. Now once you've got one side totally done, you just replicate the whole process. I think the most critical part being that you actually seat that grommet as far down as possible. And then, there we go. And once you've got the turn signal seated in its kind of grommeted base, go on, thread on that nut plate, just like the other side, kind of shove it as far into its front side of the groove as possible, and then evenly push down. And if you can't quite, I'm going to try a slightly different approach on this one, or seat the front, because I seem to have a difficulty seating. So if you get the two tangs under the front seated, that one was kind of fighting me, but you can usually kind of muscle it under there, and as long as it's seated under all four of those little barbs, the Kawasaki turn signals are very secure. It's kind of an interesting design, but it works rather well. And then on this side in particular, if all you have is a straight, so you've got one side fully tightened already, this side you can see if I use my standard Phillips, it'll work just fine, but one thing you'll want to be mindful of is when you get tight, don't let yourself crank the screwdriver down against the Fender Eliminator, because you will just gouge into the powder coat. So if you do have one of these cool ratcheting screwdrivers, right angles, go ahead and use that. It's a great way to get these really nice and secure. Just gonna do it on both sides. Okay. Once you've got the two turn signals properly mounted, we're going to move on to the license plate light. And don't go and run these looms through that hole yet, just because the license plate light's got the biggest plug on it, and you're going to want to save that one for last. So, or excuse me, you want to let that one go through the hole first. So you might as well do it now. Should fit super easily if you're just passing it through by itself. And as far as the installation of the license plate light, just make sure the lens face is towards the license plate. And then, as opposed to the factory nuts, which would work here obviously, but they don't provide a locking feature, Vagabond's going to give you these flange locking nuts, sometimes called K-locks. So the two smaller ones, the M5, you can spin them all the way down, and it's the conical washer at their base that is going to give you some spring preload while you tighten it up. And so you're going to need your 8mm wrench again. or sorry, 8mm deep socket on a ratchet or a power driver. Obviously be careful if it's on a power driver. And just tighten these up. There's no need to go crazy with it because you could rip these studs out of the license plate light. Make sure it's nice and straight, centered. And then the last thing before we move on to the motorcycle is to feed the smaller turn signal connectors through that same hole. That should be much easier than trying to finesse the big one through after you've already passed the two small ones. So get your 3 wiring looms cleanly through, and now we'll move on to installation onto the motorcycle. When it comes to installing the Fender Eliminator on the motorcycle, it's actually rather straightforward. Start by feeding the large license plate light connector, electrical connector, through the hole in the tail section of the motorcycle. Gonna feed that through, then follow it with the turn signal electrical connectors. And once you have all 3 through, you're going to have a two-handed operation where the top hand is slowly pulling the electrical looms snug on the way in, and the bottom hand is going to start to locate the 4 studs and the 4 holes. And it should, once you get things relatively centered up, kind of guide its way through, and you're just going to want to make sure that your electrical looms are not bound up and are clear. And it may kind of hold itself in place like this based on the tail section plastics kind of binding on it. But you can always grab one of the supplied lock nuts for the studs and spin it down by hand, and then you don't worry about anything dropping off. And we'll move to the top side, tighten everything up, and redo the wiring. Now, if we look at the top side, all we have to do is by hand start by installing the 4 locking nuts provided with the kit. If you do have one of these like extending magnetic wands, they actually are very useful for this part, just because it is a little tight in there. But the nice thing is that you don't have to hold the Fender Eliminator up during this process. It should be fully secured. So if we want to reuse that wiring, essentially it's just like a wiring guide for the 3 looms. I find it useful to start it a little higher up so that we are all wrapped up, and then push it down. And once you get down, you should be able to guide it right over the stud. And you can either futz around with your hand, or if you do have, just for the purposes of this video, if you've got one of these magnets to help you get it down so you can get a socket on it. So just tighten them all a little bit before you, these are locking nuts, so you don't have to go crazy tight because you still are sandwiching through some pieces of plastic. And at that point, I would always recommend you kind of step away from a power driver and just check with your hand that you're not, you can still got some, these need to be essentially hand tight. And you'll feel the lock washer portion, excuse me, of the nut, the locking nut, bottom out. And that's essentially as tight as you need it to get. So your bolts are tight. We just have to go and reconnect all the wiring. I would start with the license plate light because this connector's, again, kind of being bulky, is the easiest one to push that connector, the small side of the connector, back into the boot, and just makes it incredibly hard to recover. So what you can do, you can always grab a pair of needle nose very gently and use it to, I guess, make that connector most prominent, because you can see that little catch is the part that you absolutely need to make sure you get that tooth portion of the connector through. otherwise it won't lock, and over use of the motorcycle it'll vibrate loose. So you always need to give it a tug, make sure you've got that. Once you get there, it's pretty much black 2-pin connector to black and gray to gray, and then we'll fish out the big 3-pin connector. And if you don't hear a click, again, you're gonna have to go kind of hunting for that connector. And thankfully these are much more rigid, the turn signals are much more rigid on the second half, so they're pretty easy to just push into the boot. The last connector, again, if you don't hear a click and you can't pull it back and have it stay snug, you've got a problem. So the only kind of interesting new development here is obviously we've got a bit more wiring loom than we had at the beginning of this video, and that's not a big deal because we've got this kind of closable or reusable wire management loop. But what I would first do is close that loop, get it out of the way, and you kind of have to massage this big boot back under the subframe. So do that so that it's back from whence it came, and then you just have the looms to deal with. Now once you've gotten that boot back under the subframe, there we go. You can see we've got this guy is still pretty tight in terms of, well, this is back to where its original tightness because it's just a tail light, and then we've got this loop. My preference is always to give yourself a service loop, and so what we'll probably do is go under the tail light loom so you're not putting any extra pressure on that, and feed your service loop into the other side of the tail section. This is a little bit of more art than science, but at the end of the day, reopen your reusable cable clip, get all 4 looms that you originally started with in it, and close it, and you should have something. I'll push this a little bit more. There we go. It feels nice and secure. At that point, all we've got to do is get our toolkit back in there. Okay, and the passenger seat. And again, it's got a tooth on the back. I'll line it up, and that process is done. Now with that, the installation of the Fender Eliminator is complete. I always recommend doing a quick systems check to make sure all the lights are functioning. I'm going to give you a couple sweeping walk-around views of the Fender Eliminator so you get a feel for how close the Fender Eliminator packages the turn signals to the tail section of the motorcycle, as well as how clean the underside appearance is and how well matched it is to the geometry of that tail section of the motorcycle. With that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this video. If you have questions or like to purchase directly, we can be reached on our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com. Our parts are also available on Amazon for Prime members and eBay. Thank you.